I was the only one who genuinely. Grief, when my Emil died, then her will changed everything. The first drops of rain began to fall as I stood at the graveside after everyone else had left. Fitting, I thought, as if even the sky understood the need to mourn Beth Rivera properly. Not with the hasty, impersonal service her children had arranged. My mother-in-law deserved more than the perfunctory eulogies and awkward silences that had marked her funeral. Blake. The sharp voice cut through the gentle patter of raindrops. Caden, my husband of 5 years, stood by the cemetery gate, impatience evident in his stance. I nodded but didn't move, my fingers still tracing the simple brass nameplate on the temporary marker. Elizabeth Ann Rivera, 1955-2023, beloved mother. The epitaph felt woefully inadequate for a woman who had shown me more warmth in 5 years than my husband had in our entire relationship. Blake? Caden called again, irritation now coloring his tone. It's just starting to rain, and you know Kim has to get back to Chicago tonight. With a final silent goodbye, I turned from the grave. The rain was picking up, drumming against the simple black umbrella I held. But I walked slowly, deliberately unhurried despite my husband's visible annoyance. Let him wait. He hadn't given his mother time when she was alive. He could spare a few minutes now that she was gone. As I reached him, Caden checked his watch ostentatiously. Honestly, Blake, it's not like you were even related to her by blood. I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. The casual cruelty of his words stung, though they shouldn't have surprised me. I'd watched him treat his mother with the same dismissive attitude for years, quick phone calls on holidays, perfunctory visits when it suited his schedule, constant deflection of her gentle attempts to be part of our lives. She was good to me, I said simply, brushing past him toward the parking lot. She was good to everyone, he muttered, as if this were a character flaw rather than a virtue. That was her problem. In the sleek black Mercedes that Caden had insisted we take to the funeral, appearances matter, Blake. I sat in silence, watching raindrops race down the window while he complained about the traffic and checked emails on his phone at stoplights. 5 years into our marriage, and I still felt I barely knew the man beside me. We had met during my final year of architectural school, when his investment firm sponsored a design competition. He had been dazzling then, confident, successful, attentive. The whirlwind romance had swept me off my feet, and by the time I realized that the charming man who had courted me existed primarily for public consumption, we were already married. Beth had been my unexpected ally in the cold, achievement-oriented world of the Rivera family, while Caden and his sister Kim, a corporate attorney with a personality as sharp as her tailored suits, moved through life like efficiency machines. Beth had been warm, curious, and genuinely kind. She invited me for tea, asked about my dreams beyond being Caden's wife, and showed interest in my architectural designs that had been put on hold when Caden insisted I focus on supporting his career instead. Now she was gone, taken by a swift and aggressive cancer that had left little time for goodbyes. Caden and Kim had managed her care with the same clinical efficiency they applied to everything, scheduling treatments around their work commitments and video calling when actual visits were logistically challenging. I assume you're planning to wear something more appropriate to the reading of the will. Caden's voice broke into my thoughts as we pulled into the driveway of our modernist mansion, his dream home. Not mine. I looked down at my simple black dress. What's wrong with what I'm wearing? He sighed, that particular sigh that always made me feel like a disappointing child. Kim's bringing the family attorney. We should present a united front. Wear the gray McQueen suit. It looks more dignified. I bit back a response. Beth had never cared about designer labels or presenting united fronts. She had loved colorful scarves, mismatched teacups, and genuine conversation. But arguing with Caden was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall, exhausting and ultimately pointless. Inside, Kim was already waiting in the living room, her black Louboutins propped on our glass coffee table as she scrolled through her phone. She barely looked up as we entered. Finally, she said, I've got a 9 p.m. flight back to Chicago. Let's get this over with. Blake was having a moment at the cemetery, Caden explained with an eye roll. I'll change and be right down. As he disappeared upstairs, Kim's sharp gaze landed on me. Unlike her brother's conventionally handsome features, Kim's beauty was angular and severe, her dark hair cut in an asymmetrical bob that somehow managed to look both artistic and intimidating. You know, she said, her tone conversational but with an undercurrent of steel. My mother always had a soft spot for strays. It was her greatest weakness. I met her gaze steadily. I'm sorry you saw your mother's compassion as a weakness, Kim. A flash of something anger surprise crossed her face before she masked it with a cold smile. Let's not pretend you were anything more than a project for her. The sad little architect who gave up her career to marry my brother. Mother always did love a reclamation project. Before I could respond, Caden returned, now dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The attorney should be here any minute. Blake, go change. It wasn't a request. I hesitated, then turned toward the stairs, frustration burning in my throat. 5 years of this being talked at rather than to. Decisions announced rather than discussed. My thoughts and feelings treated as inconvenient distractions from the important business of being a Rivera. In our bedroom, I opened the closet door and stared at the section containing clothes Caden had selected for me, designer pieces in muted colors, appropriate for the wife of a rising star in the financial world. My fingers reached instead for a soft blue cardigan Beth had given me last Christmas. It matches your eyes, dear, she had said, while Caden frowned at the modesty of the gift. I paired the cardigan with a simple black skirt and flat shoes. A small act of defiance that would undoubtedly irritate my husband, but felt like the only honest choice on this day of all days. Beth would have understood. When I returned downstairs, the family attorney, Mr. Winters, had arrived. He was a thin, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful manner of someone who had spent decades navigating the emotional minefields of family wealth. Mrs. Rivera. He greeted me with a small nod. Caden's frown at my outfit was exactly as expected, but I pretended not to notice as I took a seat across from the attorney. Now that we're all here, Mr. Winters began, opening his briefcase, we can proceed with the reading of Elizabeth Rivera's last will and testament. Kim checked her watch. Can we cut to the relevant parts? Assets, distributions, any conditions? Mr. Winters blinked slowly, like a lizard contemplating its next move. Mrs. Rivera was quite specific about how this process should unfold. Miss Rivera, she requested the will be read in its entirety. Mother always did have a flair for the dramatic, Caden muttered, but gestured for the attorney to continue. What followed was not the dry legal document I had expected, but Beth's voice clear, thoughtful, and unmistakably her coming through the formal language of the will. She spoke of her life, her values, and her hopes for what her legacy might mean. And then, to my shock and the visible dismay of Kim and Caden, she got to the distributions. To my son, Caden Michael Rivera, I leave my collection of family photographs and journals, in the hope that he might one day take the time to understand the family history he has been too busy to inquire about during my lifetime. Caden's face flushed an angry red as Mr. Winters continued. To my daughter, Kimberly Ann Rivera, I leave my personal jewelry collection, which she has admired since childhood, with the exception of the pieces specifically mentioned later in this will. Kim's expression remained carefully neutral, though her knuckles whitened around her phone. And to my daughter-in-law, Blake Elizabeth Rivera, who has shown me more genuine care and interest in 5 years than my own children have in decades. I leave the remainder of my estate, including my financial assets, the property known as Wildflower Cottage, and all contents therein. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard, while Caden and Kim exchanged looks of stunned outrage. That can't be right, Caden finally said. Mother she couldn't. I assure you, Mr. Rivera, your mother was of sound mind when she executed this will 6 months ago, Mr. Winters said calmly. She anticipated your reaction and recorded a video statement explaining her decisions, which I have been instructed to play now. He produced a tablet from his briefcase, set it on the coffee table, and tapped the screen. Beth's face appeared, thinner than I remembered from before her illness, but with the same warmth in her eyes that had always made me feel seen. My dear family, she began, her voice steady despite the visible effects of her treatment. If you're watching this, then I've passed on, and Mr. Winters is executing my final wishes. I imagine there's some consternation about my decisions, particularly from you, Caden and Kim. She smiled sadly, adjusting a colorful scarf around her neck when I recognized as a gift I had brought her from a local artisan market. For most of your adult lives, you've treated me as an obligation at best and an inconvenience at worst. Your visits were rare, your calls perfunctory, and your interest in my life non-existent. I tried to tell myself it was just the busy nature of your important careers. But mothers know when they're being managed rather than loved. Kim made a sound of protest, but the recorded Beth continued as if anticipating the interruption. Blake, on the other hand, has shown me genuine kindness and companionship. She's listened to my stories, shared her dreams, and treated me not as a burden, but as a person of value. When I was diagnosed, she was the one who accompanied me to treatments when you were too busy. She was the one who called daily, not out of duty, but out of genuine concern. I felt tears welling in my eyes as Beth's gaze seemed to look directly at me through the screen. This isn't about punishment, Caden and Kim. It's about recognizing where real care has been shown. Blake understands what I valued most in life, and I trust her to honor my legacy in ways you never took the time to understand. There is more to this decision than I can explain here, but Blake will find a letter at Wildflower Cottage that will clarify everything. The video ended with Beth's gentle smile, leaving behind a silence thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Caden was the first to break it, turning to me with cold fury in his eyes. "What did you do?" he demanded. "How did you manipulate her into this?" "I didn't," I began, but Kim cut me off. 5 years, she said, her voice deadly quiet. 5 years you've been part of this family, and somehow you've managed to steal our birthright. Did you know how sick she was before we did? Did you play on her fears, her loneliness?" "That's enough," Mr. Winters interrupted firmly. Mrs. Rivera made her decisions with full mental capacity and without any undue influence. I personally verified this, as did her physician. He turned to me. "Blake, I have the key to Wildflower Cottage and the letter Elizabeth mentioned. She asked that you go there alone to read it." Caden stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. We'll contest the will." Mr. Winters nodded as if he'd expected this reaction. "You're within your rights to try, Mr. Rivera. However, your mother anticipated this possibility and prepared extensive documentation of her reasoning, including detailed records of her interactions or lack thereof with each of you over the past decade. Contesting will only make those records public and potentially damage your carefully cultivated public images." He glanced meaningfully at his watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment." After the attorney left, the atmosphere in the room was toxic with resentment. Caden paced like a caged animal while Kim sat unnaturally still, her expression calculating. "You can't possibly think this is appropriate," Caden finally said, looming over me. "Whatever game you played with my mother, it ends now. We're family. This should stay in the family." The irony of him invoking family now, after years of treating his mother like an afterthought, made something snap inside me. I stood, facing him directly. "I didn't play any game. Caden, I simply treated your mother like a human being worthy of time and attention, something neither you nor Kim managed to do until she was literally on her deathbed." "How dare you?" Kim began, but I was beyond caring about their indignation. "Beth invited me to lunch every Tuesday for the past 5 years. I continued. "Do you know why Tuesdays? Because she knew both of you were always too busy for family on Tuesdays. She told me about her childhood, her dreams, her regrets. She showed interest in my life beyond being Caden's wife. That's not manipulation. That's basic human connection." Caden's expression hardened into something ugly and unfamiliar. "You have no idea what our relationship with our mother was like. You were an outsider playing house for a few years. I've been her son for 4 decades. And how many of those decades did you actually spend being present for her?" I challenged. "When was the last time you called her just to talk? Not because you needed something or were checking a duty off your list." His silence was answer enough. "I'm going to Wildflower Cottage tomorrow," I said. gathering my composure. Whatever Beth wanted me to know, I owe it to her to find out. If you walk out that door, Caden said coldly, don't bother coming back. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw with sudden clarity the emptiness at his core, the void where genuine connection should exist. 5 years of trying to fill that void with my own love and attention had left me hollowed out. I think that might be for the best, I replied quietly, and went upstairs to pack a bag. Wildflower Cottage turned out to be a modest but charming stone house nestled among towering pines, about 2 hours north of the city. I followed the GPS down increasingly narrow roads until I reached a winding gravel driveway nearly hidden by overgrown vegetation. If I hadn't been specifically looking for it, I would have driven right past. The cottage itself was partially obscured by untended gardens that had clearly once been lovingly maintained, but had since grown wild. Roses climbed haphazardly over a small porch, and what looked like herb beds had been reclaimed by native wildflowers, a riotous explosion of color against the weathered gray stone. I sat in my car for several minutes, taking it all in. Beth had never mentioned owning a second property, and neither Caden nor Kim had ever referenced it. Apparently, there were sides to their mother they had never bothered to discover. The old-fashioned key Mr. Winters had given me turned smoothly in the lock, as if the door had been recently oiled despite the cottage's outward appearance of neglect. Inside, time seemed to have stood still. The furniture was modest, but well-chosen comfortable armchairs arranged before a stone fireplace, bookshelves overflowing with well-read paperbacks, and colorful handmade quilts draped over every surface. It looked like someone had just stepped out momentarily and would return any second. On a small writing desk by a window overlooking what must have once been a vibrant kitchen garden, I found an envelope with my name written in Beth's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. My dear Blake, if you're reading this, then I have passed on, and Mr. Winters has executed my will as instructed. I imagine Caden and Kim didn't take the news well. They never did handle disappointment gracefully, even as children. This cottage has been my sanctuary for over 30 years, though I doubt either of my children ever suspected its existence. After their father died when they were young, I thought I needed to be strong for them, which in the Rivera family tradition meant being practical, efficient, and unemotional. I channeled my grief into building a secure future, expanding Thomas's business interests and ensuring the children would never want for opportunity. But in focusing on their material needs, I fear I neglected something more important, their emotional development. By the time I realized my mistake, they were already teenagers, more interested in achievement than connection, more committed to the Rivera brand than to genuine relationships. Wildflower Cottage became my escape, the place where I could be truly myself away from the performance of being Mrs. Rivera, successful businesswoman and pillar of society. Here, I gardened without gloves, read novels instead of financial reports, and befriended ordinary people who knew nothing of stock portfolios or social hierarchies. The cottage also holds another secret one I'm entrusting to you because, of all people, you have shown the capacity to understand its value. Behind the bookshelf in the main room, you'll find a hidden door leading to a small studio. That space contains my life's true work, 30 years of painting. Something neither Caden nor Kim ever knew I enjoyed. My will has given you financial independence. Blake, the Rivera family holdings are substantial, and your share, 1/3 of everything I built after Thomas died, will ensure you need never again subjugate your dreams to someone else's expectations. But wealth without purpose is empty, as my children unfortunately demonstrate. Wildflower Cottage represents a different kind of wealth, the richness of being authentically yourself. I've watched you slowly disappear into Caden's shadow over the past 5 years. Your creativity and compassion treated as inconveniences rather than gifts. It has broken my heart to see another woman diminished by the Rivera family legacy of emotional austerity. Whatever you choose to do with this inheritance, whether you restore the cottage, sell everything and start fresh elsewhere, or find some purpose I cannot imagine, know that you have my blessing. My only hope is that you will reclaim the vibrant young woman who has been slowly fading from view in the mausoleum of a marriage my son constructed. With all my love and confidence, Beth. P.S. The people of Wildflower Cove have been my true family for decades. Maggie at the general store, Dr. Sam, who tends to everyone without concern for ability to pay, Old Frank, who keeps the community garden. They all knew the real Elizabeth Rivera, not the businesswoman facade. They will welcome you if you choose to stay, even briefly. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring my vision. Then, with renewed curiosity, I went to the bookshelf Beth had mentioned and began examining it carefully. It took some time, but eventually I discovered that applying pressure to a particular ornamental carving caused the entire bookcase to swing outward, revealing a hidden doorway. The studio beyond was magical, a light-filled space with windows overlooking the wild garden and forest beyond. Canvases were everywhere, stacked against walls, displayed on easels, hanging from every available surface. Beth's paintings were vibrant explosions of color and emotion landscapes, portraits of locals I didn't recognize, still lifes of simple objects rendered with extraordinary tenderness. In the center of the room stood an easel holding an unfinished canvas, a portrait of me, laughing at something outside the frame, my face alive with a joy I barely recognized as my own. Beside it lay Beth's palette tab, the paint long dried but still bearing the colors she'd been using that day. I sank onto a paint-spattered stool, overwhelmed by the revelation of this secret life. Beth had lived a life of creativity, community, and authentic connection that her children had never known existed. No wonder she had recognized the slow erosion of my own spirit within my marriage. She had experienced something similar and found her escape in this hidden sanctuary. As daylight began to fade, I reluctantly left the studio to explore the rest of the cottage. In the small kitchen, I found the refrigerator stocked with fresh basics milk, eggs, butter, vegetables, and a note from someone named Maggie stocked the essentials for when you're ready. Beth, we're all pulling for you. The date was just 2 weeks before Beth's death, suggesting she had planned to return here but hadn't been able to make the journey. That night, I slept in a small bedroom with a handmade quilt and windows that opened to the sound of wind in the pines. For the first time since Beth's diagnosis, I slept deeply and without dreams. Morning brought a knock at the door. Outside stood a sturdy woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun and kind eyes that assessed me frankly. "You must be Blake," she said without preamble. "Beth described you perfectly. I'm Maggie from the store. Thought you might need some proper breakfast and a friendly face." She held up a basket covered with a red checked cloth, emanating the tantalizing aroma of fresh baked goods. After a moment's hesitation, I had grown unaccustomed to straightforward kindness in the Rivera household. I stepped back to invite her in. Over freshly baked scones and strong coffee, Maggie filled in the blanks of Beth's secret life. For over 30 years, Lizzie, as she was known in Wildflower Cove, had been coming to the cottage for extended stays, particularly during the summer months when she told her children she was traveling in Europe or at a spa retreat. "She was different here," Maggie explained, gesturing expansively with half a scone. "Relaxed. Funny, she had the most wonderful laugh. Wore those flowing skirts she loved and paint-stained shirts around town without a care. Brought her easel to community picnics and captured everyone mid-bite." She chuckled at the memory. "Did she ever mention why she kept this life separate from her children?" I asked, trying to reconcile the Beth I had known warm but always somewhat reserved with this free-spirited Lizzie. Maggie's expression sobered. She tried to bridge the gap once, about 15 years ago, invited Caden up for a weekend, hoping to share this part of herself with him. She shook her head. That boy spent the entire time on his phone, complaining about poor reception and asking when they could return to the city. She never invited either of them again. My heart ached for Beth, trying to connect with her son, only to be dismissed as an inconvenience. How familiar that feeling had become to me as well. "She talked about you, though," Maggie continued, her gaze softening. Said you had the soul of an artist trapped in a golden cage. She worried about you almost as much as she worried about those children of hers, all that potential being wasted on keeping up appearances. I'm an architect, I said, surprising myself with the present tense. Or I was, before I married Caden and he convinced me that supporting his career was more important than pursuing my own. Well, Maggie said, standing to collect our empty coffee cups, Beth seemed to think you were still an architect at heart. That studio of hers has a drafting table tucked in the corner that she put in specially for when Blake visits. Though I gather that visit never happened. She never invited me here, I said, confused. Didn't have the chance, from what I understand. She was planning to bring you this summer, but then the diagnosis came. Maggie trailed off, then squared her shoulders. Anyway, she made sure you found your way here eventually. That counts for something. After Maggie left, promising to introduce me to the rest of Lizzie's friends whenever I was ready, I returned to the studio. Sure enough, in a corner I hadn't fully explored yesterday stood a beautiful drafting table. Angled to capture the northern light, brand new supplies were arranged neatly beside it: pencils, technical pens, a set of professional-grade drafting tools still in their packaging. A small card propped against the table read simply, "For Blake, when she's ready to create again. With love, Beth." Tears blurred my vision as I ran my fingers across the smooth surface of the table. Beth had truly seen me in a way my own husband never had. She had recognized my suppressed creativity and prepared this space for me even as she faced her own mortality. I spent the rest of the day exploring the cottage and grounds more thoroughly. In a small shed behind the main house, I discovered gardening tools and carefully labeled seed packets for the coming spring. A journal detailed Beth's plans for the garden, which plants thrived where, which combinations of flowers attracted butterflies and hummingbirds, which herbs grew best for cooking, and which for medicinal teas. As evening approached, my phone, which I had ignored since arriving, began buzzing persistently. Caden's name flashed on the screen, followed by a flurry of text messages. "Where are you?" This childish disappearing act is exactly why Mother never trusted you with responsibility. Kim and I have spoken with another attorney. You won't get away with this. Blake, be reasonable. Come home and we'll discuss a fair distribution of Mother's estate. The last message made me laugh out loud, startling a bird from a nearby bush. After years of dismissing his mother's importance in his life, Caden suddenly considered her estate a matter of great significance. His concern wasn't for the woman who had raised him, but for the assets she had left behind. I switched off my phone without responding and returned to the cottage. In the fading light, I moved through the rooms that had been Beth's sanctuary. Truly seeing them now, the bookshelves filled with poetry and art history, rather than the business biographies that dominated the Rivera home, the comfortable, mismatched furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. The walls adorned with Beth's own paintings and works by local artists rather than investment-grade art selected by a consultant. This cottage represented a life lived authentically, in direct contrast to the performative existence Beth had maintained in her official role as the Rivera matriarch. And she had handed me the key to this authenticity, literally and figuratively, at exactly the moment when my own identity had been nearly subsumed by the Rivera machine. I slept again in the small bedroom with the handmade quilt, and for the first time in years, I dreamed of buildings I wanted to design, spaces that nurtured rather than impressed, that embraced nature rather than conquered it, that invited genuine connection rather than staged interactions. The next week passed in a blur of discovery and decision-making. I met Beth's friends in Wildflower Cove, a diverse group of artists, retirees, local business owners, and working-class families who had all known and loved Lizzie for her generosity, creativity, and complete lack of pretension. They welcomed me with a warmth I had forgotten could exist between people who weren't trying to impress or manipulate each other. Dr. Sam, a semi-retired physician who ran the town's only medical clinic, told me how Beth had quietly funded medical care for uninsured residents. Old Frank showed me the community garden where Beth had maintained a plot for years, always donating her harvest to families in need. The owner of the local diner described how Lizzie had helped her secure a small business loan when traditional banks had refused. She never wanted recognition, the woman explained as she refilled my coffee cup. Said her name would just complicate things, but everyone knew it was her behind the anonymous donations. The scholarship fund for local kids, the holiday gift baskets. Meanwhile, my phone continued to accumulate messages from Caden and Kim, alternating between threats of legal action, attempts at emotional manipulation, and eventually, begrudging offers of compromise as they realized their position was weaker than they had initially believed. I consulted with my own attorney, not a Rivera family connection, but a sharp minded woman Mr. Winters had recommended. She confirmed what Beth's will had established. I was now financially independent, with resources sufficient to rebuild my architectural career, if I chose to, or to pursue any other path that called to me. 10 days after discovering Wildflower Cottage, I finally responded to Caden with a simple message. I'll meet you and Kim at the Rivera house tomorrow at 2 p.m. to discuss next steps. His reply was immediate. Glad you've come to your senses. The misunderstanding was so profound, it would have been funny if it weren't so sad. Caden assumed I was returning to the fold, ready to negotiate a settlement that would preserve his idea of the natural order, Rivera blood trumping genuine connection. He could not have been more wrong. The next day, I arrived at the Rivera mansion precisely at 2 p.m., dressed not in the designer clothes Caden preferred, but in a flowing skirt I'd found in Beth's closet and a simple blouse. My hair, which I'd normally straighten to conform to Caden's preference for a polished look, fell in its natural waves around my shoulders. I felt more myself than I had in years. Caden and Kim were waiting in the formal living room, the one reserved for important business discussions. Kim's expression was carefully neutral, while Caden's held a smugness that suggested he believed victory was at hand. Blake, he greeted me, gesturing to a chair across from them. You're looking relaxed. The subtle critique in his tone would once have sent me scrambling to conform to his expectations. Today, it barely registered. I am relaxed, I agreed, sitting down. For the first time in a long time. Kim cut directly to the point. We've prepared a reasonable settlement offer, she said, sliding a folder across the coffee table. 1/3 of Mother's liquid assets to you, while the property and business holdings remain with the Rivera family where they belong. Given that you've been married to Caden for only 5 years, this is more than generous. I didn't bother opening the folder. I'm not here to negotiate Beth's will. Her wishes were clear, and I intend to honor them. Caden's expression hardened. This isn't just about Mother's wishes. This is about family legacy, about assets that have been built over generations. No, I interrupted calmly. The Rivera family holdings were largely built by Beth after your father died. She was the one who expanded the business, made the key investments, and secured the family's financial future. You and Kim have benefited from her work your entire lives while treating her as an afterthought. That's ridiculous, Kim snapped. We respected Mother's business acumen. You respected what she could provide, I corrected. But you never bothered to know who she actually was. I reached into my bag and withdrew a small portfolio of photographs, Beth's paintings. Her garden, her with friends in Wildflower Cove. Did you know she was an artist, that she maintained a cottage where she could escape the performance of being a Rivera, that she had an entire community of friends who knew her as Lizzie rather than Mrs. Elizabeth Rivera? Their blank expressions confirmed what I already knew. I'm not here to negotiate, I continued. I'm here to inform you of my decisions. First, I'm filing for divorce. I looked directly at Caden, whose shock was almost comical. The prenuptial agreement you insisted on works in my favor now, as it specifies that inherited assets remain separate property. Before Caden could recover enough to respond, I turned to Kim. Second, I will be establishing the Elizabeth Rivera Foundation with a significant portion of Beth's estate. The foundation will support affordable housing initiatives, community arts programs, and healthcare access in Wildflower Cove, causes your mother cared deeply about. You can't just... Kim began, but I continued as if she hadn't spoken. Third, I'll be converting Wildflower Cottage into a retreat for artists and architects focused on sustainable community design, combining my background with Beth's passion for creativity and local connection. I stood, gathering my things. Mr. Winters will contact you regarding the transfer of the family photographs and journals Beth left to you, Caden, and your jewelry collection. Kim, beyond that, there's nothing more to discuss. This isn't over, Caden warned, finally finding his voice. You'll regret making enemies of us. I looked at him, really looked at the man I had married, with his perfect suit and empty eyes, and felt nothing but a distant pity. I don't consider you enemies. Caden, I don't consider you much of anything anymore. Your mother gave me the gift of freedom from financial insecurity. Yes, but more importantly, freedom from living according to someone else's restricted vision of who I should be. I turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Beth kept a journal at the cottage. In it, she wrote that her greatest regret was raising children who measured their worth by their achievements rather than their capacity for human connection. She worried until the end that she had failed you both in the ways that truly mattered. For her sake, I hope someday you prove her wrong. With that, I walked out of the Rivera mansion for the last time, leaving behind the golden cage that had nearly stripped me of my identity. Ahead lay Wildflower Cottage, a blank drafting table, and a future shaped by my own hands rather than someone else's expectations. 1 year later, the Elizabeth Rivera Memorial Arts Center opened its doors in Wildflower Cove. The former cottage had been expanded with a sensitively designed addition that respected the original structure while creating studio spaces, a small gallery, and community rooms available to local residents. Beth's paintings formed the heart of the center's permanent collection, finally receiving the public recognition they deserved. The garden had been restored and expanded into a community space where residents could grow food, flowers, and medicinal herbs under Old Frank's expert guidance. I had established my architectural practice in a small office overlooking the town square, focusing on sustainable community design and affordable housing initiatives. My first major project, a mixed-income housing development, incorporating green spaces, shared amenities, and spaces for small businesses, had just broken ground on land donated by the Elizabeth Rivera Foundation. The divorce had been finalized with minimal drama once Caden realized I had no interest in the Rivera name or his personal assets. His threats of legal action regarding Beth's will had evaporated when Mr. Winters quietly shared documentation of Caden and Kim's years of neglect, including text messages declining invitations to spend time with their mother and records of missed appointments during her illness. The secret legacy ending. Beth's legacy bloomed in ways neither Caden nor Kim could have imagined. 3 years after opening the Arts Center, I stood at its entrance watching children plant wildflowers in the garden named for their unknowing benefactor. Occasionally, news of the Riveras reached me through mutual acquaintances. Caden had remarried quickly a polished venture capitalist who complemented his ambition. Kim had made partner at her firm. Neither had ever visited the center, though I'd sent invitations to each exhibition featuring Beth's work. Until today, I almost didn't recognize him standing before Beth's self-portrait Caden, without his designer suit, looking somehow smaller than I remembered. I didn't understand her at all. Did I? He asked without turning. It's not too late to try, I offered, surprising myself with the absence of bitterness. He nodded silently, eyes fixed on his mother's face, captured in vibrant brushstrokes. After he left, I found a check in the donation box substantial, anonymous, but the handwriting unmistakable. With it, a note for the scholarship fund. She would have liked that. Some lessons come too late for reconciliation, but early enough for redemption. In honoring Beth's true self, perhaps her children might finally discover their own. In the garden, wildflowers bloomed defiantly against approaching autumn persistent, colorful, and gloriously free.